third of 3 lectures in this short course. The first one was on Monday when I did an overview of the Betrayal of the Promise report, highlighting various themes. And then last night, Harun Borat took a deeper dive into the economics of the financial flows, exploring this idea of corruption as a marketplace. And today I want to try and start putting in place a way of thinking about the future and the alternative. And obviously, one has to do that by taking into account the past, but we can't, unlike most economists, we can't think about the future purely in terms of the trajectories that are captive of the past, nor can we be too impatient with the present. We need to rather think in terms of a deep present or a long present, rather than the present merely as a burning platform between the past and the future. And we also need to be careful about thinking about the future purely in terms of wishful thinking, which is really quite often what flip chart driven scenario planning is often about. Reverse engineering to the present in order to manipulate the variables to get to a desired future. I'm doing a lot of work in this field of futuring and experimentation, and I like to think in terms of the evolutionary potential of the present. In other words, finding the glimpses that lie in the dynamics of the present as clues to the future. This is what is often referred to as anticipatory thinking rather than futures thinking. I don't like futures thinking very much. So that said, certainly when I think about the present moment, I am struck that there are 2 primary resources that are instigating our current economic crisis, with special reference to the Western Cape. So obviously at a national level, it's our coal-based energy system managed by Eskom, and Eskom, now it's been admitted, is going to require 5 billion rand per month, at least for the next 12 to 24 months, to pull itself out of a hole. And if it doesn't pull out of this tailspin, it could bring down the rest of the economy. And obviously that is penetrating its way through into the decisions that are being made about our president and his future, and the possibility of a transition prior to 2019. So energy is, I've always argued since we started this work on the Betrayal of the Promise, that the energy crisis actually sits at the very center of our political crisis, especially in light of the fact that when the Zuma-Gupta power elite was in its zenith, it believed that the nuclear deal was going to be its savior. So the energy and the energy crisis really is at the center of our political crisis. And obviously water, now especially reference to the Western Cape, but also nationally, is another trigger. So these are, and related to climate change. So it's really impossible to think of the future of the South African economy in a way that is decoupled from an understanding of the dynamics of resources. And that is also true at a global level. Global level, at the global, I mean, like South Africa, we're in an interregnum, and there's the interregnum really consists of the fact that the post-Second World War long-term development cycle ended in 2009. 2009 was the first year that the global economy actually shrank since the Second World War, the only year, in fact, since the Second World War. And therefore, in my view, 2009 marks the end of a long-term development cycle that began at the end of the Second World War. And that long-term development cycle was fairly evenly divided between two 25-year periods. The first 25 years was a period of welfarism, Keynesian economics, inclusion, and decolonization in the developing world. And the second 25 years, really triggered by the oil crisis of the 70s, triggered the rise of neoliberalism, a period of dismantling the state, free markets, globalization, financialization, structural adjustment, and rising inequalities. Towards the end of that period, really just the beginnings, we saw the beginnings of the rise of the BRICS countries, and with the onset of the crisis in 2007, really the acceleration of the rise of the BRICS into the present period. But we haven't yet discovered the coordinates of the next long-term development cycle. These long-term development cycles, sometimes called Kondratyev cycles, after the Russian economist who first talked about them, who got shot by Stalin, we don't really know what the coordinates of the next long-term development cycle are. It is significant, though, however, that at the end of 2016, a whole bunch of economists, including a whole bunch of Nobel Prize winners, including Stiglitz and those kinds of people, and Harun Borat, by the way, met in Stockholm and issued what was called the Stockholm Declaration. And the Stockholm Declaration has a set of 8 points. And what's significant about these 8 points is as an acknowledgement that you can't leave everything to markets, firstly. Secondly, an acknowledgement that context matters, so one size fits all doesn't apply. And thirdly, you can't address the economic crisis without addressing the environmental crisis. Those are for my 3 takeaways from the Stockholm Statement, which probably represents a nascent new mainstream consensus, going obviously beyond the Washington consensus, but also beyond the post-Washington consensus, which is more about institutional economics, but not really a fundamental break from a faith in markets. So, as we search for an alternative in the South African context, we have to acknowledge we're actually in this interregnum. The coordinates of the next long-term development cycle are not clear. What is clear is a whole bunch of dynamics. For example, the transition to Web 3.0. So Web 1.0 was really the first phase of the internet, email, and one-way directional websites. The second phase was two-way communications with websites between people. And Web 3.0 really is the Internet of Things, where machines speak to machines. And as the complexity of society becomes more overwhelming, we manage it through inserting algorithms into the nooks and crannies of society, and having faith in the algorithms. And we allow machines to begin to take over the management of the complexity via our algorithms, and our behavior gets conditioned accordingly. So when I land in Paris, I get a message from TripAdvisor where my favorite restaurants are, even though I have never been to any of them, but it knows I like Thai and Indian. And if I'm in a particular hotel and there are Thai and Indian restaurants around me, I will be told by TripAdvisor, not because anybody said anything to anybody, but a machine spoke to my machine in my back pocket, said, this is where your restaurants are. Web 3.0, welcome. Climate change is now kind of scientifically pretty much overwhelming consensus as driving a whole bunch of dysfunctionalities with major economic implications. Resource depletion is becoming a more and more serious phenomenon. We currently consume about 70 billion tons per annum. We dig out 140 billion tons. Actually, we throw away 70. We use 70 billion tons, and the cost of getting many of these resources out of the ground is escalating rapidly. For example, oil. In sustainability economics, there's something called the energy return on energy invested. And what that refers to in very, very simple terms is how much oil you need to spend in order to get oil out of the ground. So in the 1930s, to get 100 barrels of oil out of the ground, you needed 1 barrel of oil. So with 1 barrel of oil, that's the amount of energy required to get 100 out of the ground, transported, processed in an oil refinery, transported, used. That's basically what the value chain looked like. You needed an oil for it. You needed a barrel for 100 barrels. Now, in other words, the ratio is 1 to 100. The energy return on energy invested ratio was 1 to 100. In the 1930s, today it's 1 to 10. And you can't mess around with that number. It's like, that's what it is. And it causes not necessarily a rise in prices, but price volatility. So for a lot of the oil resources that need to be reached in order to meet global demand, you need a minimum oil price of around $60. If the price is below that, it causes a real problem with supply. So what we have is a volatile oil price. So if global demand goes up, the prices will go up. You'll have an increased demand, which will initially trigger supply, but not sufficient. Prices will then go too high, knock the growth rate out. Growth will drop, the prices will drop. Accordingly, investments will recede, and so we go through this volatile cycle. So the issue is not so much oil production peak, it's more oil consumption peak. And that becomes a major constraint on growth as we know it, growth as dependent on the burning of fossil fuels. We then also have, obviously, the accelerated instability of a financialized global economy. As you're aware, one of the key features of the second phase of the post-Second World War long-term development cycle was the financialization of the global economy, which really refers to the massive growth of the financial sector as a driver of growth, especially through debt-financed consumption. And that, in turn, obviously has got a lot to do with the so-called G2, where the Chinese were producing massive surpluses. Those surpluses were not being paid to Chinese workers, but were being lent to Western consumers via treasury bonds and other mechanisms, which in turn had to be forced into the households of Western consumers by almost artificially valuing the property that they owned. And obviously that whole bubble crashes, starting in 2007 with the subprime crisis, because the underlying value of those properties was not what everybody thought they were. So where we're left with now, in the middle of this interregnum, is two militarized superpowers, well, kind of superpowers, that are mounting hegemonic projects around two energy sources that are increasingly unviable. So Trump, who appointed as his Secretary of State the former CEO of the largest oil company, ExxonMobil, really, besides being a buffoon, is kind of like it's like Custer's last stand for the oil industry. A key objective, obviously, is to bring down oil prices, to make a whole bunch of oil exploration and extraction possible, and that in turn is not going to be possible without war, without violence. So depending on how that plays itself out. Putin has got a different strategy. For Putin, the building of Rosatom is basically Russia's foreign policy. It's the construction of nuclear power plants in countries around the world. And as one observer put it, A Russian nuclear power plant is like a combination of an embassy and a military base. It's a means of global geographic control. And if you put all of these pieces together and take into account the rise of social protest and the increasing legitimacy of increasingly radical alternatives on both the left and the right, we start to get a sense of the kind of ideological context for our own search for a more progressive, more inclusive, more sustainable economic policy. That said, we're on the African continent. And on the African continent, there are two narratives. The one is Africa Rising, which is really a reference to the rise of African economies off the back of the commodity boom. And those who did that wisely and managed their resources and built up sovereign wealth funds and so on are in a fairly good position to manage the consequences of the decline in the commodity prices. But the other narrative alongside of that it's partly instigated by it, is Africa Uprising. Not Africa Rising, but Africa Uprising, the growth of the phenomenon of about major uprisings in 40 African countries, which some have referred to as the third great wave of African uprisings. The first wave got rid of colonialism, the second wave got rid of the dictatorships of the 1980s, and now we have the third wave of African uprisings, hardly any of which is reported, but is obviously going to have effects. Exactly what those effects are is very difficult to tell. African uprisings are kind of glacial. They move imperceptibly and make an enormous amount of noise, and what's left behind is completely different to what was there before. So it's in that context that I think we need to think about the future of our own economic policy. It's very, I suppose the summary of all of that is there are no easy grand narratives to turn to figure out the coordinates of our own economic policy framework. There isn't anybody out there kind of putting a lot of pressure on us to think in a certain way, which is different to the 1990s when we were under a lot of pressure to think as neoliberals. So I think what we can say is that there is complete agreement across the board that poverty, unemployment, and inequality are our biggest challenges. That's nothing profound to say. But to date, though, economic policy has been based on the assumption that economic growth measured in terms of annual GDP growth is the best way to address these challenges. Anything that promoted economic growth was measured in terms of GDP was deemed to be good for society. What is ignored is the fact that the South African economy needs to be structurally transformed. As it is currently structured, economic growth will tend to benefit the elite and not trickle down to the poor. What is needed as an alternative, as a general statement, and I'll try and unpack it, is a well-being economy, as Lorenzo Fioramonti calls it, premised on an expanding sector of small and medium enterprises, both for-profit and non-profit, increasingly self-reliant economies, and a rapid redeployment of investment capital into the real economy and out of speculative financial instruments and property developments. To make this happen, what is needed is a well-being premised on an expanding sector of small and medium-sized enterprises, both for-profit and non-profit. I bring together the whole social enterprise discourse into the picture. Increasingly self-reliant local economies and the rapid redeployment of investment capital into the real economy and out of the speculative financial instruments and property developments. So to make this happen, I would suggest that the focus should be on infrastructure investments. And that would mean shifting a lot of our large-scale, a lot of investment out of large-scale, capital-intensive industrialization and more into what's going to be reinforcing of smaller businesses and local economies, in particular with respect to energy, mobility, water, and communications. The end result, I would submit, and then I'll unpack, could be accelerated inclusive growth. So let me go through that. The economic growth rate in 2016 was 0.3%, and it's likely to be similar in 2017 into 2018. Global conditions are not helpful when it comes to economic growth. Western Europe is bumping along the bottom. Growth has slowed down in China. Resource prices have declined and are at best volatile. Drought is ravaging many places, many agricultural sectors. Manufacturing is wobbly and in decline many places, and climate-related natural disasters are getting worse. So it's not a great time. South Africa is living beyond its means. Domestic expenditure exceeds domestic production. Government spending exceeds government revenue. Imports exceed exports. Household expenditure exceeds household income. Investment demands exceed saving supply. And corporates are holding back investing their available cash in long-term dividend-generating initiatives. There's plenty of spare capital actually available in the public and private sectors. Nevertheless, economists continue to say South Africa is capital hungry and therefore we need foreign direct investment. I just don't get that. Total factor productivity measures the efficiency of all inputs into production. Improvements in total factor productivity depend on the extent of innovation and the related levels of investment in research and development, the availability of skilled labor, the level of technological development, and the effectiveness of managers and their management systems when it comes to combining all the inputs in an efficient and effective manner. South Africa's TFP, total factor productivity, has declined over the past decades. There were 15 annual declines in TFP between 1990 and 2014, resulting in the fact that TFP was 22.6% lower in 2014 compared to 1989. And this has got a lot to do with the mismatches between cost and productivity of labor, short-termist approach to capital investment rather than long-termist dividend orientations, inadequate infrastructure, low levels of innovation, inappropriate technologies, and high levels of inequality. On the positive side, we're one of the 30 largest economies in the world. We have a robust legal and constitutional framework. We're still a democracy despite state capture. We have a sophisticated financial system, a diversified economy, and an array of, albeit disconnected, positive policy frameworks in the social and environmental sectors. Most concerning of all is this weird fact that the South African economy on average has returns on investment since 1994 that have been high and for a number of years on a par with China, but the levels of investment have been low. So you can make good profits, but the amount of investment that we get into the economy doesn't seem to fit the fact that we have this high levels of return on investment. And that is somewhat of an anomaly. Instead, the high levels of concentration have made it possible for powerful corporates to use their market power to inflate prices and thus make good profits, while using their market power to keep competitors out of the marketplace. An uncompetitive marketplace, unfriendly regulations, plus rampant corruption makes it almost impossible for small and medium enterprises to flourish, and in particular to secure investments from financial institutions who have the cash to lend to them, who prefer funding large projects rather than a multiplicity of smaller ones because the transaction costs, therefore, are lower relative to the size of the investments. The fact that the so-called mineral energy complex, the mineral energy complex that constituted the core of the apartheid economy remains largely intact, remains one of the major challenges in the democratic era. Very little has been done to change this, other than emphasize the need to transform the racial composition of the mining sector or the extractive industry sector. This has succeeded to some extent, but the basic economic structure remains intact. The domination of by the MEC, by the mineral energy complex, and the financialization of the economy during the post-94 era explains why it has been difficult to diversify the South African economy. Diversification via the expansion of the light manufacturing sector and the multiplication of small and medium enterprises in all sectors holds the key to the building of an inclusive well-being economy. But I would add a rider to that. I have a wonderful PhD student called Andrea van Zyl. She's a chartered accountant in the accounts department at Stellenbosch University and an IT specialist. And I've just read the first draft of her amazing PhD, which essentially argues that we must make a conceptual distinction between small and medium enterprises and entrepreneurship. The association of entrepreneurship with small and medium is problematic because, as she argues, a lot of small and medium enterprises really just compete for one another for rents, but compete between each other for rents rather than actually driving, being driven by innovation and the construction of new value chains. It's a really interesting point, that. So, coal was the energy source that powered the construction of this economy, and the MEC was built to facilitate the extraction and use of coal. So coal-fired power now is double the price of renewables. And the renewable energy sector, up until the Minister of Finance closed it down, was one of the fastest growing renewable energy sectors in the world and the fastest growing non-services sector in South Africa. It has created new decentralized socio-technical infrastructures in the small towns across South Africa, thus triggering mini economic booms in these locales. The CSIR has predicted that renewables can, estimated, not predicted, that renewables can meet 90% of South Africa's energy needs. Instead of reinforcing the highly centralized MEC, renewables have the potential to create the energy foundation for a completely new job and livelihood creating set of local economies. Now, if you now ask the question, have we since 1994 ever had what Mbisi Jonas calls an economic consensus? He has called for a new economic consensus. I have doubts whether there was an old one. It is argued that we've never had one. The closest we might have come was the original RDP after 94. However, this was replaced by GEAR, the Growth, Employment and Redistribution Policy of 96. It was imposed by the Minister of Finance with minimal consultation. This was later upgraded and renamed as GISA, which included a reference, thanks to Danny Roderick, the Harvard economist, to the notion of binding constraints that need to become the target of policy to unlock. In the early 2000s, as the debt finance consumer boom reached its limits, public sector funding of national infrastructure emerged as a substitute to debt financed consumption. This underpinned the adoption of the developmental state discourse from 2002 onwards. This was followed later on by the New Growth Path and the National Development Plan. The former was driven mainly by DTI, but with little funding for the central tenet of this policy, which was industrial sector policy. The National Development Plan talked about flexible labor markets and had very little critical to say about the financialized nature of the economy, whereas the New Growth Path was much more critical of financialization. So there were quite significant differences between these two. Despite promises given to the alliance partners by the NDP Commission, the National Planning Commission, that the rather weak economic chapter of the NDP would be revisited, in particular the notion of flexible labor markets, this never happened. Cyril Ramaphosa chaired that meeting, promised to have the meeting again, to have that conversation. That conversation never happened. When I interviewed Trevor Manuel about it a couple of months back, he said, yeah, we did try and call meetings, the unions never pitched. So I don't know what the truth is. We now have, today, radical economic transformation, or the more respectable version when Minister Gogaba is somewhere else in the world, inclusive growth, both of which lacked any systematic articulation. Now, during the Mbeki era, economic policy tended to emphasize market-oriented strategies coupled to a BEE approach that linked emerging black business to contracts with deals with white business. The real economy was transformed by three forces that I spoke about on Monday that undermined investments in the productive economy, namely financialization, the shareholder value movement, and BEE. Financialization was about stimulating growth via consumption spending. Shareholder value was about corporate restructuring, focus on your knitting to increase shareholder value, and BEE was about transfer to historically disadvantaged individuals, none of which really generated the kind of productive value or the investment-led growth that we really needed. During the Zuma era, the focus shifted to procurement by the SOEs as the primary vehicle for building a black industrial class. And this had two consequences. Firstly, capital deepening, because these are capital-intensive industries, and it set the framework for state capture. So what I'm going to do now is make suggestions on what the alternative could look like, which is really this idea of investment-led, sustainable, and inclusive growth. This is what I would like to spend the rest of the year thinking about with a new research group that I have set up to work full-time on this and engage with the policy networks. And I want to kind of unpack this by referring to 10 points. The first is that we need a homegrown growth model. So this really talks into my introductory comments about the global context, that there isn't a narrative we can go to and draw down. Not that we'd ever really want to, but that's how it's worked in the past. Even if we want to now, there's not a lot of places to go to. Okay? So almost have no choice. We need a homegrown model. The growth model that existed since the 80s is pretty much, the kind of neoliberal agenda really is no longer delivering the goods. Economists agree that we need two fundamental global strategies, which, if they come about, would be advantageous to us. If they don't, we have even bigger problems. The first is we need, at a global level, a coordinated global fiscal stimulus to aggregate demand, which is what was being thought about by the G20 in the 2008-2009 period, sometimes referred to as green Keynesianism. And secondly, to channel exorbitantly large pools of unspent cash in the global economy into infrastructure in particular, and in particular urban infrastructure. These two is what's needed at global. In the absence of that, what do we do? A homegrown investment-led growth model will address this challenge by incentivizing inflows into fixed investment, limiting hot money flows, and shifting the primary focus from attracting FDI to mobilizing domestic, private, and public sector investments. There's a lot of spare cash in the private sector, and I disagree with those who say that just doesn't make sense. Where's this money? I think there's enough empirical evidence of where it exists, in particular if you count what I would call short-termist investments. So I think a lot of the people who disagree with the notion that there's lots of money don't factor into their calculations what I would call short-termist investments. If you say what we need is long-termist investments and everything else is spare and it must be directed in that direction, I think you get to the right kinds of numbers. And if you dovetail that with the unwisely spent public sector cash, then I think we could generate what we require. I do agree, for example, with those who are arguing that we don't need an IMF bailout for the $5 billion a year that Eskom needs, that actually our own we could generate that within our own financial system. Secondly, we need to address climate change and resource scarcity, and what this boils down to is a commitment to becoming a world leader in the decarbonization of our economy as an economic growth strategy, not as a way of saving the climate, although that would be a byproduct. That's, if you like, the mitigation end of that way of thinking. On the adaptation end, there's an enormous amount to be gained. Imagine if we had thought adaptively about our water crisis. People like myself were writing 10 years ago that all the indications were that we would, by 2015, between 2015 and 2018, be facing major water crisis in the Cape Town-Stellenbosch area. It's exactly what happened. And there, in other words, we are a living case study of the failure to invest in adaptation, and look at the costs of that. So now just take that and project forward and say, well, what else are we missing now? And what should we be investing in that actually is going to save us money over the long run? In other words, a long-termist view when it comes to climate and environment-related issues. So that's my second major point. The third is the whole question of the diversification of the economy. South Africa remains locked into a capital-intensive, energy-intensive, and highly financialized historic growth path that firstly reproduces self-serving rent-seeking by the old white, foreign-owned and new black rentier class. Secondly, is too dependent on the financial inflows and commodity booms, making the economy extremely vulnerable to global shocks. Thirdly, creates far too little new wealth and new productive value in the economy. And fourthly, excludes large numbers of South Africans from participating either as owners of capital or as employees. So the recent a budget statement at the end of last year by Minister Gagaba was quite interesting. He said government debt has ballooned since the financial crisis from 27% of GDP to over 50%. That, however, goes up to 56% of GDP if you include the state-owned enterprises. The downgrade knocked off maybe 1% of growth, has put tax revenue under pressure, which exacerbates the crisis, and we are very, very close to the fiscal cliff. And obviously, the Eskom tailspin is what would take us over the cliff. We will not grow nor transform this economy if we do not radically increase the levels of fixed investment in the economy. South Africa's fixed capital investment as a percentage of GDP stands below 18%. And this has contracted for 6 of the last 9 years. Fixed investment in China, by contrast, for example, is 47% of GDP, and South Korea 30%. So we are below 18%. So that has to, this suggests that we need to urgently and deliberately diversify the economy through identifying new sectors, enter industrial policy, in which we could be competitive, leverage investment, particular domestic investment, and rapidly grow output and jobs. To do this, we need to give clear policy direction, invest heavily in innovation and technology development, invest in skills and logistics efficiencies, as well as work with our banks to develop creative financing mechanisms to increase the availability of venture capital. I think we need to radically rethink the role of the development finance institutions, like the Land Bank, the Development Bank, and the IDC. I sit on the board of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, so I'm talking with some experience and authority about what needs to be done, because the problem is that all of these DFIs have kind of been left to their own devices. They haven't been refinanced and recapitalized for years by the state. And the consequence is they're becoming more and more just like banks. So what you need from DFIs is to do what the Development Bank has done, which is to say we are interested in a maximum of 4% return on capital. We're interested in long-termist investments. We're interested in dividends. And we want to stop identifying ourselves purely as a lender. We want to be seen as a leverager. So the 20 billion or so that we lend out each year should be leveraged to 100 billion a year, which means setting up a whole new family of institutions to partner with private sector institutions, where you allow the private sector to, where the DFI takes the senior debt and the private sector the lower risk debt, and in that way you kind of mobilize and leverage financial investments into the kinds of investments that the economy needs. But this has to happen on a much larger scale with a lot more money, and that's not going to happen if DFIs are left to their own devices and are not refinanced. So the priority areas for me within this question of diversification of the economy would be rebuilding the SME manufacturing sector, reversing the outflows of capital. Many of our big corporations spend most of their time in terms of their strategic thinking on how to get money out of the country. So Steinhoff is a great example. Where I come from, our currency is called Bitcoin. So the transition to a renewable energy, rebuilding the national transport infrastructure, refinance the DFIs, a special program for reducing youth unemployment, the revitalization of our national infrastructure program, which exists in name but is kind of now defunct, and a pro-poor public works program. Those are kind of the elements of diversification. So, fourth point, address inequality. We have an extraordinarily high level of inequality, as we all know. In terms of the Gini coefficient, for those countries where it's reliably calculated, we are the most unequal in the world. Now, it's well known that inequality is not good for growth, and that's for obvious reasons. If wealth spins around in the top portion of the pyramid, and the networks with low levels in the pyramid are weak, circulation is poor, and so you don't maximize the potential of the economy. We did implement a very successful welfare program in South Africa. In fact, we have more people on welfare than have jobs, which is both a success and a failure. And yet inequality remains. We have the 90-10 phenomenon. So an investment-led inclusive growth strategy would be the best way to diversify our economy. However, a key condition for that succeeding is going to have to be massive reductions in inequality. And that's not going to happen that's not going to happen gently. There are some people who are arguing, like David Lewis from Corruption Watch, that there's never been a case of successful redistribution without a war or major conflict. And he argues that's never happened democratically. I'm not sure that that's true for the Scandinavian countries. Fifthly, we need to reap our youth dividend by overhauling our education and training system. And I'm not going to say much more about that, but I think it's not just a case of improving our teachers and refinancing our universities. It's also how we create within our education system the kind of culture of innovation and entrepreneurship that builds the caliber of people that we need for the long run. The sixth point would be to align land reform with rural enterprise development. Handing out land unlinked to investments in the kind of enterprise development that is required in order to build successful agricultural enterprises is a luxury we can no longer afford. It was a stupid and ridiculous strategy to assume that just the transfer of land is going to do the trick. However, even if we get that right, in other words, coupling enterprise development with land reform, by building on a whole number of quite successful initiatives out there, we will, however, have to pay attention to the fact that we have high levels of soil degradation. It's been estimated that 5 million of the 14 million hectares of arable land in South Africa are degraded. And we are using inappropriate irrigation systems on soils which shouldn't be irrigated in the way that they are being irrigated. And we have a very uncritical attitude towards the use of fertilizers and pesticides, which has a well-known negative impact in the long run on soil productivity. So there isn't actually a significant, there is the land care program, which does look at soils issues, but we really need to kind of prioritize soil productivity using agroecological methods. Seventhly, we need a new deal for South Africa's towns and cities. So in April last year, the Cabinet approved a document called the Integrated Urban Development Framework, which referred specifically to the fact that we need a completely new way of thinking about urban infrastructure. Urban infrastructures have tended to be designed in the past as if resources are unlimited, that there are no scarcities, that you would never have a water problem like we've had in the Western Cape. That has all changed, and we have to fundamentally rethink our urban infrastructure so that we move our cities from linear metabolisms to circular metabolisms and put more and more of those urban grids connected to renewable energy grids, and in that way start transforming the nature of our cities. The Integrated Urban Development Framework refers specifically to a new instrument, which is integrated infrastructure plans, which is a way of integrating the multiplicity of infrastructure plans that you find in municipalities, which are normally disconnected because you have different disciplines running them. So you have a water plan, you have an energy plan, you have a transport plan, you have a waste plan, and these things don't connect. Integrated infrastructure plans is around connecting them. So the priorities for the urban sector would be re-establish democratic governance, rebuild the administrations, implement the IUDF, in particular the infrastructure plans, support mixed income housing, targeted transport subsidies to get people out of cars and into mass transit, change local government regulations so that we create more opportunities for the informal sector and small and medium enterprises, and the proper integration of renewable energy infrastructures into the tax bases of the towns, rather than what's happening at the moment, where they are not connected to the local tax bases. The eighth point that I would make is obviously building a legitimate and capable state, and that really is about continuing to build up the campaign against state capture, which has been pretty successful, I would argue. And it's very, very, very clear that without the rebuilding of, in particular, the state administration to become an effective developmental state set of institutions, we're not going to be able to get very far. My ninth point is South Africa is recognizing the fact that South Africa is part of a sub-regional African economy, that future economic factors must factor in this reality as a major focus. This dependency includes economic arrangements and processes such as the customs union, energy and transport infrastructures, future markets for South African goods, sub-regional migrations of people, and information communication technology. However, it's also about cultural development with respect to the arts, crafts, medicinal remedies, national and ethnic identities, and literary and musical movements. That's the cultural infrastructure of the economic integration that we're looking for. And then finally, we need to make our economy fit for purpose by moving beyond the very well-practiced South African capacity for building visions and chattering away about the future, but not doing very much to make sure that it gets implemented. And that brings me back to my earlier proposition that the future lies in an emphasis on small and medium enterprises, but not small and medium enterprises that are simply about competition for access to rents, but are driven much more by the build-up of entrepreneurial capabilities in both the for-profit and non-profit sectors. So for-profit entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship as key drivers, as key economic drivers within a framework that is protected, a developmental framework that is protected by a democratic state and a capable bureaucracy, is a realizable vision. If that in turn is connected to decarbonization, support for the support for rather than suppression of the renewable sector, the phasing out of coal, and the restoration of our biodiversity resources so that we become far more resilient in the face of climate change, we then have the makings of a just transition that is appropriate for the 21st century, no matter what happens at a global level as the rest of the world figures out how to creep its way out of the interregnum that it currently faces. Thank you very much. Sorry, that took a bit longer than I thought it would, so we have about 10 minutes or so for questions. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, you. The real reason for the shutdown of the renewables was it was too successful and was a threat to the nuclear deal. So that's the real reason. The ostensible reason was a whole bunch of complexities around payments and levels of payment for the to the independent power producers who were putting electricity on the grid, where Eskom was arguing that what was necessary to make them financially viable was too high. And there was no agreement on how to resolve that problem. I mean, I do think it's pure politics. It's shutting down billions and billions and billions of investments in a sector that was not politically controlled by the right network.
Your plan is sort of common sense, and I'm not, I wonder what sort of appetite the country has for that common sense plan. But also you talk about one of the key points is addressing inequality, and that's never occurred without some sort of war or whatever. So how does that sit, with everything else? Surely addressing inequality is going to scupper everything. I don't quite see how that can be part of a logical plan.
Yeah, no, I share your concern. The way I would think about it is that you can, when you think of the levels of inequality and how structurally entrenched it is, the temptation is to then arrive at the conclusion that you can only deal with inequality through structural change. And that sounds eminently logical and gives you an intellectually satisfied feeling that you've understood the fundamental contradictions of capitalism, and all you really have to do is now structurally transform it, either getting rid of it or turn it into a human thing. What does that mean tomorrow when you wake up? Things don't change by saying we need structural change. that just gives you an intellectually satisfied feeling that you kind of know what needs to happen. But you wake up the next morning, what changes the next morning is incremental. It's bits and pieces that move along incrementally over time. So, which then cumulatively amount up to a qualitative shift. So the trick when it comes to the kind of entrenched challenges we face is how you keep focused on inequality as a structural challenge, but make sure the types of incremental shifts and incremental changes and gains that you can make start to add up to a shift in power. And that's going to result in the kinds of interventions that a strong state is going to need to take, which would be at the level of taxation or a once-off capital reallocation or targeted interventions against those who are unproductively utilizing their wealth. There's a whole range of interventions that are possible that, if are coupled with ways of building real new value, just redistribution without the construction of new value actually creates new fire hydrants of cash for the rent seekers. And that's not going to do the trick. So it's how you create new value and intervene to slowly kind of break the stranglehold on the economy that the wealthy have. And I don't have an easy way even of expressing it. I mean, what I've said, if I was sitting in front of a group of politicians now, I would have lost them on this one. But I don't know. I would like to find a way of telling the story more accessibly.
I have three questions about mine. Just to go back to something you said at the beginning about how we're not currently being forced to think neoliberal in the way that we were in the 90s. If you could just expand on that.
Well, in the 1990s, if you were at international fora and you weren't using the right phrases, you were kind of regarded as strange, like a kind of subhuman species. You know, I mean, economists are these Jedi Knights of the global economy, and if you don't make it into that inner ring of, and you don't know the secret language in order to be admitted to that inner ring of the super powerful, you were regarded as a kind of subspecies. And there was an arrogance, an intellectual arrogance, a confidence, a level of pressure to conform on weaker governments that was absolutely extraordinary. The intellectual confidence is gone, although the policy frameworks are more or less still in place. But the policy frameworks are delivering austerity, not necessarily good things. And so there's a whole bunch of people in developing countries who are saying, well, geez, this is not working. Why do you think we should listen to you? And that's quite a healthy place to be. So you can be rude now. It's kind of respectable to be heterodox and kind of like, you know, I want to do my own thing. Context matters. Yeah.
And then you talked about how it's difficult to encourage investment in SMEs, in part because of the higher transaction costs than investments in larger corporations. So how could we flip that? How do you...
I mean, it's a very, very crude solution to the problem of transaction costs. Subsidize them. You can't actually impose on financial institutions the full costs of a social objective. So if transaction costs are going to go up in order to move cash or get in place decision-making systems that allows you to get cash into the more difficult corners of society, subsidize it. You know. So just to give you one instrument, the European Union funds a project preparation facility in the Development Bank of Southern Africa in order to lower the costs, the transaction costs for the Development Bank to put money where it should go. Without funding because these transaction costs are very high because the high-skilled personnel that you need for project preparation is actually, according to a recent study, is the fundamental blockage on the African continent for why we have so much money on the African continent, so many needs that need to be met, but a small investment pipeline. Why? The answer is the small number of highly skilled people who manage the due diligence and the project preparation processes. Those are the transaction costs.
And then the third was a general question around who needs to buy in and how do you get them to buy in to a kind of plan like the kind that you have proposed on a mass scale.
Well, I mean, everybody needs to buy into it. The future economic policy makers need to buy into it. And in order for that to happen, you have to win the intellectual battle in the economic policy making profession and more broadly. So you actually, there's an intellectual battle to be won for what I actually feel flattered that you think that this is pragmatic and common sense, because I think that's the idea. Radical pragmatism is far more effective than a kind of ideological mystification that creates the illusion of simplicity. That's a useful phrase to end off one. Okay, thanks very much. There's one more question over there.
Given the infiltration of rent seekers and brokers you talked about into all levels of our economy, from political life, from the cabinet, to the SOEs, down to municipalities, and the hollowing out of institutions, many of those people would now be keeping their heads down and hoping not to be noticed. What are the chances of state structures at least adopting any really innovative strategy?
Well, if the condition that you describe is permanent, then the answer to your question would be none, no chance. But if the condition that you described is not permanent, because we have a constitutional court, a mobilized civil society, watchdog institutions in the non-profit and public sectors, etc., 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 and there is a mobilization taking place against that, and there is at least rhetorical commitment by the new political leadership to root out corruption, and Deputy Chief Justice Zondo issued a press statement yesterday saying, give me my terms of reference, well, maybe the condition is not permanent, in which case your conclusion might be a little bit more optimistic.